welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really embarking on a journey, I think, into the heart of a geopolitical flashpoint.
Hmm.
We're doing a deep dive into the evolving political crisis in Georgia.
Right.
And this isn't just about, one nation at a crossroads. It feels like a struggle where its very identity is hanging in the balance.
Absolutely.
A contest for its future that, well, it sends ripples far beyond its own borders. The material we're looking at today paints a really vivid, quite compelling picture of this complex situation.
It certainly does.
So our mission really is to unpack its many layers, hopefully reveal some surprising facts and crucial insights. We want to help you understand not just what's happening, on the ground, but why it matters so profoundly. Connect the dots, if you will, to the larger geopolitical landscape.
You're absolutely right. And what's at stake here is it's truly profound for both Georgia, of course, but also for Europe itself. This crisis, it directly challenges the European Union's declared interests, its core values, and frankly, its very identity as a global actor.
A strategic test, then.
Very much so. It's a strategic test for Europe itself, with consequences that could easily ripple across the entire continent and probably beyond its immediate neighborhood, too. It really asks some fundamental questions about the EU's role and maybe its resolve in the 21st century.
Okay, let's unpack this then.
Yeah.
We start in Georgia, a country many have viewed for a while now as a, burgeoning democracy, but suddenly it seems to have taken this dramatic and for many a pretty unexpected pivot away from its long-stated European aspirations.
Yeah, the descriptions are stark. It's described as being at a critical crossroads, even facing a crisis of an existential nature.
Existential, wow. So you've got the ruling party, Georgian Dream GD, they call it. They've been in power since, what, 2012?
That's right, since 2012.
And they abruptly, it seems, decided to derail the country from its European path. This wasn't some gradual shift, was it? It feels like a sharp, decisive turn.
Very sharp. And the context here is crucial. This decision came hot on the heels of parliamentary elections. Elections that both domestic and international observers flagged as, well, basically fraudulent, marred with serious irregularities.
Right. So that immediately casts doubt on the whole democratic process there.
It does. It raised immediate, serious concerns about the fairness and legitimacy of the process within the country.
And the timing of this U-turn is, well, it's something else.
It's particularly striking, yes. This dramatic shift, it really reached its peak right after Georgia gained the highly sought-after status of candidate for EU accession. That was December 2023.
I remember that. It was a huge deal, something Georgians had wanted for decades.
Exactly. A goal as people have yearned for, actively pursued for decades. They invested significant effort, real hope into this European future. So the critical question just jumps out at you. Why? Why would a country turn away from a goal it had just achieved, a goal so clearly desired by the vast majority of its population?
It makes no sense on the surface.
It really doesn't. And this decision by the ruling party, GD, it triggered massive ongoing protests across Georgia, huge demonstrations. And these marked the culmination of really year-long unrest. This wasn't out of the blue. It was provoked by a series of measures taken by the ruling party that were clearly designed, you can see the pattern, to erode democratic institutions and suppress dissent.
What kind of measures are we talking about?
Well, moves against civil society organizations, the infamous foreign agent law attempts, media crackdowns, increasingly restrictive legislation, all of it created this tense, volatile environment leading up to and especially following the election.
So this reversal. It's not just an internal Georgian affair. The material calls it a self-inflicted alienation from Europe. That sounds pretty serious. And the implications,
Yeah.
they must be huge.
They absolutely are. Far-reaching and incredibly significant. Beyond Georgia itself, think about the region. That U-turn, as it's called, would undoubtedly affect the regional balance in the South Caucasus. Well, not in a good way. It would be to the severe detriment of democratic and pro-European forces there. Essentially, it tilts the scales of power and influence, squarely in Moscow's favor.
So you get an illiberal Georgia.
Exactly. Imagine an illiberal Georgia, estranged from Europe, increasingly aligned with Russia. Such a scenario. It would undoubtedly enable Moscow to reassert significant influence in the South Caucasus. And this region is described as integral to the Kremlin's wider ambitions of dominating the Black Sea.
So it's not just regional politics. It's about strategic control, access.
Precisely. It's about Russia's strategic access and control. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the EU picture, This crisis is deeply consequential for the EU's own identity. It's declared foreign and security policy goals.
It's a direct test, isn't it, of the EU's political will, its resolve to uphold security and values on the continent, especially right there in its immediate neighborhood.
And the enlargement process itself, that's profoundly challenged too. Enlargement, usually seen as this powerful driver of democratic consolidation, stability. That whole mechanism is being questioned. It's not just about adding a new member anymore. It's about the very integrity and effectiveness of the entire process as a tool for promoting peace and democracy. Can it actually work if a government decides to actively undermine it?
Okay, so the stakes are incredibly high for Georgia, for the region, for the EU itself, yet the material we're looking at suggests the EU's response has been, well, to put it mildly, feeble at best.
That's the term used, yes. And it captures a certain sentiment.
And this perceived weakness. It's understandable, really, that it's triggered deep frustration among Georgians. They must feel abandoned in their struggle. And it's drawn sharp criticism from those who advocate for a more, resolute European stance.
Absolutely. The absence of a strong, united EU position, particularly after those flawed elections and the repression of the demonstrations, it really laid bare significant divisions, not just among member states, but even within the EU institutions themselves.
We saw that play out, didn't we, with Hungary and Slovakia?
We did. Specifically, opposition from Hungary and Slovakia at that EU summit back in December 2024. It prevented the EU from adopting any meaningful sanctions against the individuals directly involved in the crackdown on protesters.
So, no real consequences for those responsible.
At that time, the only measure that was actually expected to be adopted, and even that was a slow, debated process, was maybe suspending visa-free travel for Georgian officials, which, compared to the gravity of the situation.
It seems quite limited.
Exactly. That kind of limited response against the backdrop of such fundamental shifts happening in Georgia is what drew such strong criticism.
Which leads to the question, is the problem just these vetoes?
Yeah.
A couple member states blocking things? Or is there something deeper going on here?
That's the critical question, isn't it? And the material we have suggests, yes, there might be something deeper. It indicates the deeper issue is a lack of motivation, a lack of will, perhaps, from those in national capitals and in Brussels, too, who, frankly, would rather not spend significant political capital on this particular crisis.
Hoping it just goes away. Or settles down.
Perhaps. There seems to be a prevailing hope for some sort of transactional relationship to eventually emerge from the current disruption, allowing the EU to maintain some level of engagement without having to take a really firm stand on the democratic backsliding.
But the material calls that hope delusionary.
Emphatically so. And why? Because the vast majority of the people have endorsed the reform agenda of European integration, and they are proving it. How? Through the sheer scale, the persistence, the determination of the protests we've been seeing.
Right. These aren't small fringe groups.
Not at all. This isn't a fringe movement or some fleeting moment of dissent. It's a popular outcry. It cuts across generations, across social strata. It demonstrates a really profound commitment to a European future. So if this is neglected, if the EU doesn't respond adequately, the crisis in Georgia risks broader, more severe ramifications for the EU itself. It challenges its geopolitical influence, its transformative capacity, and its vital soft power.
And that's where it gets really interesting, looking at how these core EU strengths are being tested. Hashtag tag testing the EU's geopolitical power. Okay, let's dive into that first pillar then. The EU's geopolitical power. I remember former High Representative Josep Borrell claiming that Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine provoked the belated birth of a geopolitical EU.
He did say that, yes. A strong claim.
And it seemed backed up, initially at least, by the unprecedented action the EU took against Russia after February 2022. Extensive sanctions, military aid to Ukraine, a pretty rapid reorientation of European foreign policy.
A definite shift in posture.
And as part of this new, more resolute stance, European leaders endorsed what they called the geopolitical imperative to ensure that countries in the EU's neighborhood are fully integrated into European structures and kept out of Russia's orbit. That felt like a clear declaration of intent. The EU is going to actively project power, defend its interests.
It did. But what's particularly striking now, looking at Georgia, is the direct contradiction between that bold declaration of a geopolitical EU and the current reality. The material notes, quite pointedly, that Georgia slipping toward authoritarianism and drifting into Russia's sphere of influence would therefore invalidate claims about the EU as a geopolitical actor, exposing them as complacent at best.
So the rhetoric doesn't match the reality on the ground.
Essentially, yes. If the EU cannot secure its own immediate neighborhood, if it can't prevent a country like Georgia with deep historical ties, a clear popular desire for European integration from pivoting away like this, then its claims of geopolitical prowess start to ring a bit hollow, don't they?
It undermines the whole idea.
It does. Brussels' inaction, or perhaps perceived inaction, in Georgia fundamentally undermines any claim that the EU is a truly viable foreign and security policy actor, one capable of defending its interests and its values right there in its own backyard. To be a geopolitical power, and importantly to be perceived as one, the EU needs to be able to make timely decisions and act firmly on them, especially when its interests align so perfectly with its values and, crucially, with the democratic aspirations of the citizens in these partner countries.
And it's not just about the EU's image, is it? Georgia's U-turn. It fits into a larger pattern.
Absolutely. This isn't just a domestic political crisis unfolding in isolation. It's part of a much larger geopolitical struggle, one escalated by Russia. Russia is actively, methodically working to reassert its sphere of influence across Eastern Europe. And that very much includes curtailing Western influence in the South Caucasus.
And the EU's approach to enlargement seems caught up in this.
It does. At a time of actual war in Europe, the EU seems to have, as the material puts it rather starkly, neglected the fact that opening the prospect of accession for Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia also means being prepared to protect these countries.
Protects them how? Militarily.
Well, that protection involves, first and foremost, backing Ukraine in its military struggle with Russia. That's seen as absolutely decisive for the future of the European order. But it also means dealing effectively with various forms of destabilizing Russian interference, the kind we're seeing in Moldova, and crucially, the kind playing out now in Georgia.
So enlargement isn't just a technical process anymore.
Exactly. In this context, EU enlargement transforms from being, sort of technical exercise guiding countries through reforms into a profound geopolitical undertaking. It becomes about confronting a revisionist adversary, Russia, that is actively seeking to undermine this entire project by any means necessary, turning these aspiring partners back into spheres of Russian influence.
But if the geopolitical stakes are so clear, why does Europe seem divided? Why the apparent lack of this geopolitical reflex Borrell talked about?
That's the puzzle, isn't it? The material suggests there might be a different and more cynical geopolitical instinct at play. It calls it a misplaced geopolitical realism.
Misplaced realism, what does that mean?
This line of thinking suggests that pushing the Georgian Dream government too hard, imposing tough sanctions or conditions, might actually backfire. It might only drive Georgia deeper into the arms of the EU's competitors in the region, namely Russia, but also China.
The argument being better some engagement than none.
Sort of. The argument goes that the EU already pursues transactional foreign policies with various non-democratic regimes elsewhere in the world, so why should Georgia be treated any differently? This approach prioritizes maintaining some form of stability, some channel of communication, over actively, perhaps riskily, supporting democratic forces on the ground.
It's a very complex calculation. And the Ukraine war seems central to it.
Deeply intertwined, yes. The material directly connects developments in Georgia and Ukraine. It suggests the Georgian Dream government's disruption of relations with the EU and the US isn't random. It's seen as a calculated move, a cynical gamble, really, on the future of Western power.
What's the calculation?
They appear to have calculated, or perhaps hoped, that Putin's Russia will make further gains in Ukraine. And relatedly, that maybe a new Trump administration, if it comes to power in the U.S., will either further disengage from the region or, at the very least, take a purely transactional approach to countries like Georgia, regardless of their democratic credentials.
Basically betting that Western resolve is faltering.
That seems to be the underlying bet. And on the flip side, should the U.S. and Europe actually fail to support Ukraine effectively, well, the material warns that the whole eastern neighborhood of the EU could risk falling under Russia's control. This interconnection between Ukraine's fate and the situation in the South Caucasus confronts the EU with a really stark dilemma. Either commit to much stronger, comprehensive engagement, actively defending its values and interests, or effectively accept Russia's expanding sphere of influence with all the long-term implications that holds for European security. There isn't much middle ground.
But this idea of misplaced realism, would it actually serve EU interests in the long run? Especially in Georgia.
The material argues very strongly against that. It says that in Georgia's specific case, adopting this kind of stiff geopolitical realism wouldn't be business as usual at all. In fact, it would amount to a sharp, deeply damaging turn in the EU's policy stance. Why? Because it would effectively deny over 2 decades of transformative partnership.
All that investment.
Exactly. It would damage the EU's credibility because, let's remember, the EU has been Georgia's primary international partner for a very long time, investing heavily in its economic development, its democratic reforms, its overall transformation. This isn't a new relationship, it's a deeply embedded one.
And the government's actions seem to contradict the country's own foundations.
That's another crucial point raised. It's vital to remember that this decision, the one to disrupt the EU accession process, belongs to a political party that, according to the material, managed to stay in power through unfair and irregular elections. And critically, this decision runs counter to both the clear expressed will of the Georgian people, who consistently show strong pro-European sentiments, and the Constitution of Georgia itself.
The Constitution mandates EU integration.
It explicitly mandates the government to take all measures to ensure the full integration of Georgia into the European Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So for the EU to accept the government's current course would mean disregarding both the democratic will of the Georgian people and the country's own foundational legal framework. It's a very difficult position.
So the EU's previous approach, this sort of unstrategic patience with the Georgian Dream government, it hasn't really worked out as intended, has it? It seems to have backfired.
That's a crucial point the material makes. This cautious approach, often adopted perhaps for the sake of maintaining some form of stability or engagement, seems to have actually strengthened the negotiating position of Georgia's ruling party.
How so?
It's enabled them to hedge their bets, essentially, to play international actors off against each other, diversifying their range of partners beyond just the EU and the West.
Is there an example of that?
A powerful example given is the Georgian Dream government turning to China to build Georgia's first deep-sea port at Anaklia. This port is a vital element of the so-called Middle Corridor trade route.
The route bypassing Russia.
Exactly. It's a strategic bypass for Europe, designed to circumvent traditional Russian-controlled routes. So China's involvement there isn't just about commerce. It's a direct challenge to the EU's own regional influence and its strategic objectives for connectivity.
That's fascinating.
It is. And it shows, as the material concludes on this point, how supposed geopolitical realism might, therefore, produce the opposite outcome, undermining Europe's geopolitical power and its normative power simultaneously. It becomes a lose-lose scenario for the EU. Inaction designed to avoid conflict or maintain stability actually ends up creating greater strategic vulnerabilities down the line. Hashtag tag testing the EU's transformative power.
Okay, moving beyond the pure geopolitics, this crisis also profoundly tests what's often called the EU's transformative power. Its unique ability to foster change, promote democracy, inspire reform in countries that want to join.
That's right. It's a cornerstone of the EU's foreign policy identity.
And the argument is, if the EU fails to act decisively in Georgia, this transformative power, well, it will be greatly diminished.
That's the concern. Georgia's anti-democratic, anti-European turn really underscores the limits of this power, or at least the limits of how it's been applied so far. This reversal, it also undermines the conventional rhetoric we often hear about the success of the enlargement policy as a major driver of democratic consolidation.
Because here it seems to be driving the opposite.
Or at least failing to prevent the opposite. Georgia's illiberal turn marks a major setback for the EU's policy of promoting democracy in its eastern neighborhood. And this is a region where the EU has invested heavily, since the late 1990s, through various partnership agreements, aid programs.
Things like the Association Agreement?
Exactly. Milestones like the 2014 Association Agreement, which included that deep and comprehensive free trade area, the DCFTA, and also the 2017 Visa Liberalization Agreement. These were seen as really significant steps, deepening the partnership, fostering a path towards European standards, integrating Georgia economically and socially.
So why did it prove so fragile? After all that effort, all that investment over decades?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The material suggests a couple of key reasons. Firstly, it argues this policy was neither driven by a long-term vision for Georgia's eventual accession. Remember, that prospect wasn't formally put on the table until 2022.
So no clear end goal for a long time.
Right. And secondly, it wasn't framed by a sharper understanding of regional geopolitics and Russia's behavior. The EU's focus on political and economic reforms was essential, obviously, and it brought many benefits. But the analysis here is that it was never sufficient. Because it lacked that crucial geopolitical dimension. It lacked an explicit recognition and perhaps a strategy to counter the pervasive Russian threat that was always lurking in the background, always seeking to undermine Georgia's westward path. So without that long-term strategic vision for the country and the region, and maybe without adequate tools or the political will to address democratic backsliding effectively when it started, the progress that had been made proved incredibly vulnerable. Vulnerable to internal erosion by the government and vulnerable to external pressures from Russia. The foundations were there, but maybe the strategic scaffolding to protect them wasn't strong enough.
And it seems the EU might have missed the warning signs, overlooked this creeping illiberalism from the Georgian Dream government.
The materials suggest that, yes, that the EU perhaps underestimated the government's true political aims, which, it argues, were primarily about the consolidation of its grip on power rather than genuine European integration, despite the rhetoric.
Even granting candidate status didn't change that.
Paradoxically, no. Even granting Georgia candidate status in November 2023, which was hugely celebrated by Georgian society, remember, but came with a list of democratic reforms still needed, even that ended up further emboldening the ruling party.
How did it embolden them?
Well, it seemingly led almost directly to the swift adoption of that controversial foreign agents law in May 2024, a measure widely seen as mirroring Russian legislation used to stifle civil society and independent media, directly contradicting European values.
And the EU did react to that, right?
It did react. In response to that law and other anti-democratic measures, the EU halted Georgia's accession process. It downgraded political contacts, and it suspended significant financial assistance. That included $30 million under the European Peace Facility money, usually for defense support, and $121 million in direct budget support to the Georgian government.
So consequences were applied.
Yes, but what's particularly insightful, or perhaps worrying, is the observation that this sequence of events marked the end of GD's double game. You know, the pretense of moving towards Europe while consolidating power at home. That game was up. However, the material critically notes the EU's reaction has come too late to reverse the government's course of action.
Too little, too late.
Potentially. And crucially, the EU was also seen as unable to confront the GD government's propaganda and conspiratorial rhetoric effectively.
What kind of propaganda?
Well, the Georgian Dream Party gradually, systematically worked to discredit the EU in the public eye. They started associating the European path with negatives, with war, with destabilization. They even alleged, quite cynically, that Europe and the U.S. aimed to push Georgia to open a second front of the Ukraine war, right there in the Caucasus.
Using the trauma of the 2008 war.
Exactly, instrumentalizing the very real traumatic memory of the August 2008 Russia-Georgia war to sow fear and mistrust of the West. And alongside that, the ruling party insinuated that things like mainstreaming LGBT propaganda, as they termed it, were conditions for joining the EU. Deliberately framing EU integration not as an opportunity, but as a direct threat to Georgian identity, traditional values, national sovereignty. It's a powerful, deeply cynical narrative.
And the EU struggled to counter it.
It seems so. Struggled to offer a clear, resonant message of its own that could effectively combat that disinformation campaign.
This really reveals, doesn't it, that maybe the EU was unprepared to deal with illiberal regimes of this kind, unprepared to anticipate and neutralize the hybrid strategies they use right within aspiring member states.
That seems to be a key finding. And we've seen similar patterns elsewhere, haven't we? Before these irregular elections in Georgia, think about Moldova. Russia's intrusion in Moldova's 2024 presidential vote and in the referendum on EU membership there, it really exposed the vulnerability of these partner countries in Eastern Europe to Russian interference, to hybrid campaigns.
What do these campaigns involve?
Often a sophisticated mix, you know? Disinformation, financial leverage, political manipulation, cyber attacks, all designed to sow discord, undermine trust in democratic institutions, and turn public opinion against Western alignment.
And the EU's usual toolbox isn't enough.
The material explicitly states that the standard sort of technical approach to enlargement, monitoring the adoption of the EU acquis, the body of laws and regulations, is completely inadequate in these situations. It's inadequate if a ruling party decides to hijack the country's future, as seems to be the case in Georgia, or if a large chunk of public opinion can be swayed by Russia-driven propaganda and financial influence, as arguably happened in Moldova. The problem isn't just about ticking boxes on reforms anymore. It's about combating active, hostile subversion from within and without.
So connecting this to the bigger picture, what's happening in Georgia, it's really consequential for the EU's enlargement agenda as a whole, isn't it?
Profoundly consequential, yes. Remember, that agenda has been praised recently as perhaps the most far-reaching geopolitical and strategic of all the EU's responses to Russia's invasion. A primary tool to reshape the European political and security order by integrating new partners.
But Georgia challenges that narrative.
It directly challenges the deeply held confidence about the effectiveness of the enlargement policy as a powerful tool to promote democracy, the rule of law, and respect for fundamental rights. Because here, it seems to be failing, or even being actively reversed.
Which leads to the obvious question. Could Georgia set a dangerous precedent for other candidate countries?
The material suggests it absolutely could. Yes, it could impact, for instance, Armenia's recent efforts to pivot away from Russian influence and diversify its foreign policy. If the EU is seen as ineffective in protecting its partners or promoting democracy, that could shrink Armenia's options or willingness to move closer to Europe.
And the Western Balkans.
For the accession countries in the Western Balkans, leaders there who are already playing a pretty complex balancing act, juggling relations between the EU, Russia, China, Turkey, they might be tempted. Tempted to gain more room for maneuver, maybe distance themselves from the EU's sometimes demanding reform agenda while consolidating their own power at home. They might look at Georgia and see a model for how far they can push the envelope without facing truly significant repercussions from Brussels.
So this isn't just about Georgia at all.
Not at all. It's about the very future and credibility of EU influence across its entire neighborhood and the long-term viability of its enlargement strategy as a geopolitical tool. # testing the EU's soft power.
Okay, finally, let's look at that third pillar, the EU's soft power. Its ability to attract, to influence, not through coercion, but through the appeal of its shared values, its culture, its model of democracy and prosperity.
A crucial element of the EU's global standing.
And the political crisis in Georgia, combined with the EU's maybe lukewarm response,
Yeah.
it ultimately challenges the EU's identity as an actor that upholds democratic norms, right?
Yeah.
Which is central to that soft power.
It absolutely does. But there's a fascinating paradox here. Despite the Georgian government's actions, the struggle of the Georgian people for their European future, often against incredible odds, that struggle demonstrates the depth of their European aspirations. It shows the enduring appeal of the EU within the country.
So the government is moving away, but the people still want Europe.
Overwhelmingly so, according to the material. It confirms that the vast majority of Georgians endorse Europe's values and embrace the European way of life. There's a deep-seated affinity there. And what makes the ongoing protests so significant, so powerful, is that they are not fueled by opposition parties. They're driven by ordinary citizens.
Across the board.
Yes, cutting across generations, across social groups,
Right.
resulting in this massive popular mobilization. And their demands are crystal clear. They want a European future for Georgia. That's what they're marching for.
That image of them waving EU flags is quite powerful.
It's incredibly compelling. The material highlights this visual. Georgian protesters waving those blue and gold EU flags, defying intimidation and violence from their own government forces. They are literally putting their bodies on the line, proving their readiness to fight for their country's European future, demonstrating their attachment to democratic values that seem to transcend immediate political calculations or affiliations.
It makes Georgian society itself the EU's main ally there.
Precisely. The material calls Georgian society Europe's principal ally in the country, a potentially powerful force for change right there from within. And you see recent declarations from EU officials reflecting this understanding. They're expressing solidarity with the Georgian people and very deliberately placing the responsibility for the suspension of the partnership squarely on the Georgian authorities. It's an acknowledgement that the people are on Europe's side, even if their government currently is not.
Okay, so EU officials have expressed solidarity. They've blamed the authorities. But the critical question remains, is that enough? Is rhetoric sufficient?
Probably not. The material describes Georgia as a major test for the EU's ability to adjust its approach to supporting civil society, especially in times of acute crisis like this and against these mounting anti-democratic trends we're seeing. The message is clear. Words need to be followed by tangible demonstrations of support.
Has there been tangible support?
Some, yes. The EU has, to its credit, redirected that $121 million in assistance away from the government and towards programs that directly benefit civil society organizations, independent media, and so on. And that $30 million under the European Peace Facility, previously earmarked for defense support for the government, has also been reevaluated or suspended.
But more is needed.
The material emphasizes that More needs to be done to protect critical voices from government repression. This isn't just about providing funding, although that's important. It's also about active political protection, diplomatic pressure, finding ways to shield those on the front lines of the democratic struggle from harassment, intimidation, or worse.
Because if the EU doesn't offer that tangible support, what happens to its credibility?
That's the core issue. The EU's political inertia, its perceived inaction in the face of the Georgians' fight for European values, would speak volumes about its credibility, not just in Georgia or the region, but globally.
And that could backfire.
Absolutely. The resulting disappointment, the disillusionment among the Georgian people could deeply undermine the attractiveness of the EU, its main asset, that very soft power appeal we were talking about. It would also, very conveniently, fuel the Georgian dream government's narrative, the one that says Georgia has gained very little out of its partnership with the EU and has been subjected to unfair, hypocritical treatment.
So inaction strengthens the anti-EU narrative.
Exactly. A lack of concrete, robust action in support of the demonstrators and civil society would severely damage the EU's soft power. And the analysis adds another layer. This is all the more so because the EU's gridlock is, in part, the product of rising illiberalism within the EU itself. That internal challenge directly undermines its external influence and moral authority.
That's a really crucial point. The internal divisions weakening the external stance.
It creates a major strategic dilemma, and the material provides a very clear, stark example of this internal challenge impacting the situation. The visit of Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán to Georgia.
What happened there?
He went to Georgia, publicly endorsed and legitimized the contested election results, and actually congratulated the Georgian Dream Party on its overwhelming victory.
While the official EU position was condemning the elections and the crackdown.
Precisely. Orbán's act directly undermined the EU's leverage and credibility. It effectively signaled to the Georgian government that, hey, some people within the EU actually tacitly support your illiberal turn, even as Brussels officially condemns it. It's a stark illustration of how these internal divisions can completely cripple the EU's external influence and weaken the very values the Union claims to uphold on the world stage. #outro.
So, after diving deep into all these layers, the geopolitics, the transformative power, the soft power, what does this all mean for the future? For Georgia's future, and maybe for the future trajectory of the European Union itself?
Well, connecting all these threads, the picture that emerges is that Georgia's future as a free and democratic state seems to depend on two crucial, tightly interwoven factors. First, the sheer determination of the Georgian people themselves, their willingness to keep making their voices heard despite the repression they face.
And second,
Second, the policies the EU decides to implement. How proactive, how decisive will Brussels be? The material is absolutely unequivocal on this point. Procrastination is not a strategy.
doing nothing is not an option.
Essentially, no. The EU needs to calibrate its approach, find the right balance to prevent Georgia from sliding fully into authoritarianism and pivoting definitively toward Russia. And the analysis suggests this requires a firmer stance toward the Georgian dream government, making it clear there are real costs, raising the political and economic price for those individuals responsible for the democratic crackdown and the state capture that we've been discussing.
But, as we just talked about, that necessary firmness seems hampered by the EU's own internal struggles. That's a major impediment, isn't it?
It's precisely the issue. The material concludes the EU has failed to take meaningful action primarily due to its internal divisions and the veto of a few EU member states, highlighting Hungary and Slovakia again as examples blocking stronger responses.
So the EU can't act effectively.
This political fragmentation within the EU, as it's termed, it precludes adequate, timely action on the crisis in Georgia. And as a direct consequence, it damages the EU's credibility in the eyes of Georgians, yes, but also in the eyes of other partners and the wider world. The current gridlock within the EU, this inability to speak with one strong, unified voice on such a critical issue, it testifies to a lack of a vision and political will to deal with the broader geopolitical standoff in the region. The standoff where Russia is actively challenging the European order.
So the path forward, it isn't just about crafting a policy for Georgia in isolation, is it? It sounds like it demands a much broader, redefined strategic vision for the entire Eastern European neighborhood.
Absolutely. That's a key takeaway. Devising an effective approach to the political crisis in Georgia, helping reverse its drift away from Europe in line with the clear will of its citizens that cannot be disconnected from the larger priority.
Which
The larger priority of countering Russia's attempts to essentially take over Europe's eastern neighborhood to reestablish a dominant sphere of influence. So the EU needs to redefine its interests with respect to Georgia, but see it as part of a broader clarification of its overall strategic approach to Eastern Europe.
And this is urgent.
The analysis stresses this is all the more urgent given the uncertainty over the future of American engagement in the region. With questions about long-term U.S. commitment, Europe, more than ever, needs to be prepared to act as a unified, decisive geopolitical actor in its own neighborhood.
And finally, there's a really interesting point challenging a common misconception or maybe an excuse often used to justify inaction. The idea that you can neatly separate interest from values.
Yes, the material argues very strongly that we need to reject the false dichotomy between interests and values that some present as an excuse for inaction. It asserts quite forcefully that the EU's interests in Georgia have always been about promoting values. Values like democracy, rule of law, human rights, fostering a stable, peaceful, prosperous neighborhood aligned with European norms.
So abandoning those values is abandoning EU interests.
That's the core argument. To abandon these values in Georgia wouldn't be some clever realist move. It would be abandoning the very strategic interests that the EU claims to uphold in the region. And the final provocative thought the material leaves us with is this. It is far from clear what interests would be served by letting Georgia down. In fact, it argues, doing so would likely be a profound strategic miscalculation with long-term negative consequences for the EU itself.
That really is a powerful thought to leave you with, isn't it? As you reflect on this deep dive today, maybe you consider those implications of inaction, not just for Georgia, a nation quite literally fighting for its European future right now, but for the very core identity, the influence, the credibility of the European Union in what's clearly a rapidly shifting and often quite challenging global landscape. What really stands out to you about the EU's role, its responsibilities, and its own neighborhood, and what could be the long-term consequences of this strategic test on its geopolitical ambitions, on its transformative power, and on that vital, enduring soft power? Lots to think about.